They say history smells of dust and old paper. But this story smells like smoke, sweat, and something far worse. Picture a quiet European port at dusk. The year is 1347. The sea is calm, the sky is fading to violet, and a handful of merchant ships slide silently into the harbor. No fanfare, no trumpets, just the creak of wood and the slap of water against hulls. On the decks, sailors stagger ashore. Some are feverish, some are already dead. And down in the dark, in the warm, rotting straw and grain, fleas cling to the backs of black rats, like tiny living needles loaded with a weapon no one can see. In a few short years, that invisible weapon will rip through continents. It will kill an estimated 1/3 to over half of Europe's population. Entire families erased, villages wiped from the map. The deadliest pandemic in recorded history, arriving quietly on the tide. And almost no one will understand what is happening. Imagine living in that world. You don't know about bacteria. You've never heard of germs. There are no microscopes, no lab tests, no vaccines waiting in a freezer. There is only your faith, your neighbors, and whatever stories the priest or the town healer can offer when the coughing starts. First, it's just rumors, whispers of a strange sickness in distant lands. Tales from merchants about cities where the dead pile up faster than they can be buried. You hear numbers that don't even sound real. Whole streets empty, bells tolling all day and night, until even the sound of mourning becomes background noise. Then it comes closer. One day, a cart rattles into your town from the next valley over. Someone on it is coughing. Their skin is hot and slick with sweat. By morning, their lymph nodes have swollen into grotesque black-blue lumps, buboes, like someone has buried hot stones under their skin. They scream when touched. The town healer tries herbs, prayers, bleeding. Nothing works. Within days, more people fall ill. The sickness moves faster than any rumor. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, devout or sinful. It leaps from house to house, bed to bed. Sometimes it seems to sprint ahead, appearing in villages that have had no visitors at all. As if it's riding on the wind, you start to notice the smell. The scent of death isn't just one smell. It's layers. Sweat, waste, the copper tang of blood, the sweet, sickly rot of bodies being stored inside churches because the graveyard is full. Incense can't cover it anymore. The smoke from candles hangs heavy, mixing with the stench into a choking fog. No one knows what to do. Some people turn to God with desperate intensity. Processions wind through the streets, people barefoot and weeping, whipping their own backs bloody in hopes that their suffering will stop the plague. Others blame outsiders, foreigners, minorities, anyone who doesn't fit the story they want to believe. Fear spreads faster than the disease itself, and the plague doesn't care, keeps moving, across trading routes and river systems, riding the backs of fleas and rats, hitchhiking in bundles of cloth, sacks of grain, and the fur of animals. It burns through crowded cities, but it does not spare the countryside. You wake up one morning to find that, in a nearby village, the bells have gone silent. Not because the dead have stopped coming, but because there is no one left to ring them. In some places, entire towns lose over half their people. Imagine walking through streets where every second house is boarded up, not because people are away, but because everyone inside is dead. Doors nailed shut to trap in the air, as if wood could stop a disease no one understands. For the survivors, time stretches into a long, strange nightmare. You start marking the passage of days not by festivals or market days, but by how many carts of bodies roll past your window. The old patterns of life break apart. Fields go untilled. Harvests rot in the sun because there are not enough hands to bring them in. Livestock wanders untended, lowing and bleeding in empty pastures. But while the plague destroys, it also rearranges. This is the part of the story that feels almost impossible. After the first horrifying wave passes, Europe does not just grieve, transforms. For generations before the Black Death, most peasants lived trapped under a heavy weight, tied to the land, working for lords with little control over their own lives. There were many people and not enough land. Labor was cheap. Human beings were expendable. The plague flips that balance almost overnight. When 30, 40, even 60% of the population is gone in some regions, something unexpected happens. For the first time, there are more fields than farmers, more work than workers. Labor becomes precious. And when people suddenly become rare, they become powerful. Surviving peasants begin to realize that they have options. A lord who treats them poorly risks losing them to a neighboring estate desperate for workers and willing to offer better terms. Wages rise. Serfs, people who were once legally bound to the land, start negotiating, moving, demanding cash instead of backbreaking unpaid labor. Imagine watching that shift from ground level. You're a farmer who has always assumed your children will live and die on the same patch of land you did. Now, someone rides in from a nearby town and says, "If you come work our fields, we'll pay you more than you've ever seen in your life." For the first time, you hesitate before automatically saying no. Across Europe, landlords panic. They try to freeze wages, to pass laws that fix people back into their old places. They insist that nothing has changed, even as half their tenants lie in the ground. Governments write angry decrees demanding that workers accept the old, low pay. Many peasants simply ignore them. When you've watched half your village buried in mass graves, a fine for asking too much doesn't scare you as much. Slowly, unevenly, the social structure of Europe begins to crack. You can see it in the clothes people wear. Survivors sometimes dress better, using inheritance money or abandoned goods. You see it in the food they eat. With fewer mouths to feed, meat and bread become more available to people who once lived on the edge of starvation. You can see it in the cities too. Urban centers, once choked with people, now have empty houses and abandoned workshops. Ambitious peasants move in, bringing rural skills into the city. Guilds, organizations of artisans and merchants, face labor shortages, forcing them to accept new members and loosen strict rules. The plague hasn't just killed millions. It has shaken Europe's rigid hierarchy. Even the church, the central pillar of medieval life, cannot escape the shock. In many towns, priests and monks tend the sick bravely and die in huge numbers. Entire monasteries are wiped out. In other places, religious leaders flee, leaving their frightened flocks feeling abandoned. Prayers and processions fail to stop the disease. Miracle relics do nothing. For a lot of people, this creates a painful question. If God controls everything, why has He allowed this? Some believers double down, clinging tighter to faith, convinced that the plague is divine punishment for sin. Others begin to quietly doubt. If the church cannot protect them in their darkest hour, what else might it be wrong about? These doubts don't explode all at once, but over the next century and beyond, they simmer and grow, feeding into movements that will eventually challenge the church's power, question old authorities, and lay the mental groundwork for the Renaissance and the Reformation. Out of one of the darkest tragedies in human history, new ways of thinking begin to take shape. Of course, if you had stood in the middle of a plague-stricken street in 1349 and tried to explain all of this to someone, they might have stared at you in disbelief. The idea that this horror could lead, generations later, to better lives, richer ideas, and social change would have sounded cruel, even insane. When your neighbors are dying in days, distant futures are a luxury. Survival is the only plan. You focus on practical questions. Do you stay, or do you flee to the countryside? If you run, are you bringing the disease with you? Should you avoid certain foods? Should you shun strangers? Is the plague in the air, the water, the alignment of the planets? You look for patterns in chaos because the human mind hates the idea that disaster is random. And beneath it all, something else is happening quietly. Knowledge is being gathered. City officials start writing death records. Chroniclers keep journals describing symptoms, burial practices, the speed of the disease. Doctors try, and mostly fail, to treat patients, but they also observe, compare, and argue. Even superstition has data hiding inside it. Centuries later, scientists will look back at these accounts to reconstruct what happened. They'll identify the culprit. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium traveling through fleas, rats, and human lungs. They'll debate how exactly it moved, how fast, why it hit some areas harder than others. They will do what medieval people couldn't: see the enemy. But they will also notice something else. The Black Death didn't just end lives. It ended a version of Europe. Before the plague, most people lived in a tightly controlled pyramid of power. Kings, nobles, clergy at the top, peasants tied to land at the bottom. After the plague, cracks run through that pyramid. Over time, those cracks widen into fractures. Higher wages and better bargaining positions for workers. More mobility between town and countryside. Land, once scarce, now available to tenants who could never have dreamed of it before. A slow, uneven improvement in living standards for many survivors. It's not a simple good outcome. Nothing can justify that scale of suffering. But if we zoom out, we see that the Black Death forced Europe to ask new questions. What is a human life worth? Who gets to decide how society is organized? If old institutions can't protect us in a crisis, should they keep their power forever? And if the world can change this fast, if entire towns can vanish in a single season, what else might be possible to change? In the centuries that follow, Europe will see revolts by peasants demanding fairer treatment. It will see merchants grow rich enough to rival nobles. It will see new cities, new art, new philosophies. It will sail across oceans, for better and for worse, reshaping the planet. The Black Death doesn't cause all of this on its own. History is never that simple, but it acts like a massive, brutal reset button, smashing old systems, shattering certainties, and making space, in the most painful way imaginable, for something new. And today, when we think about pandemics, we still live in its shadow. We have vaccines and antibiotics now. We understand germs. We can map a virus's genetic code in weeks. But we also know how fragile our systems are, how quickly hospitals can fill, how fast fear can spread, how vulnerable the poorest and most marginalized always are. We've seen cities fall strangely silent in lockdowns, flights grounded, streets emptied. We've watched people argue over what to believe, whom to trust, which story explains the chaos. In those moments, the 14th century doesn't feel so distant. The Black Death is not just a story about rats and fleas and medieval streets. It's a mirror we hold up to ourselves. It shows us how humans behave when the world stops making sense. It shows us how fear can divide us, and how shared catastrophe can, sometimes, push societies toward more fairness, more questioning, more change. It is a reminder that even the darkest chapters in our history are not just about suffering. They are also about what comes after, the rebuilding, the renegotiating, the reimagining of what a society can be. In the end, the Black Death was a storm that Europe barely survived. But in its eerie, devastating silence, in the empty fields and abandoned houses, in the new wages and new doubts, in the questions that refused to go away, the seeds of a different world were already taking root. And whether we realize it or not, we are still living in that world today.